So the plan is for this to be the first of a two-part video about the fall of Marcos. This video is going to focus on his third term from 1981 to 86, as well as the assassination of Ninoy Aquino. And the next video is going to be all about the People Power Revolution of 1986. So what I want to do over the next few weeks is I want to go through every single president that leads up to Duterte and go through, I guess, their accomplishments, their problems, how the terms kind of ended and started, and I just want to go into all of it leading up to the next presidential cycle. So we're going to go through Aquino, Ramos, Arap, GMA, Noynoy, and finally Duterte. This is a plan in my head, and I hope I finally, I actually push through with all of this, because I think personally it's partly because I don't feel like I know enough about their administrations, and so I want to learn more about them and share what I'm learning out loud so that other people can learn as well with me. So I'm not just learning alone. Now, for this specific video, which is going to be about the 80s of Marcos, I think that, over the past few weeks, I was reading this book called The Conjugal Dictatorship, but that book was published in 1976. So the 10 years between 76 and 86 is not part of that book. And that book is the most common book used to look at the Marcos administration. So I wanted to know the gap between the end of that book and the People Power Revolution. So I did my own research. So the content of this video comes from 10 different papers I looked up on JSTOR. JSTOR is this online resource where you can have access to many academic papers written in different journals over the years. And I kind of just Googled Marcos 1980s or something, and I searched Marcos 1980s, and I found around 10, 11 different papers that seemed relevant, downloaded them, and I read all of them and wrote some notes and condensed things into what would fit into a video like this. So I hope you learned something. I learned lots of interesting stuff as well, and I'll just kind of go into the things that I learned from doing my own research. It's important to set the stage of what the economy was like in the Marcos administration, especially during the 70s. At least what I read, the 70s seemed to have been a better decade for the economy than the 60s was. So in a sense, the Marcos administration's martial law period, at least through a certain period of time, improved the economy to a certain extent. Now, what's important to remember is that when martial law was first declared in 1972, while there were many people who were against it, such as the Aquino faction, the Osmeñas, the Lopezes, many people of the left, people who were just people on the left generally were quite against the martial law mandate. There was also a broad acquiescence among the population that maybe that's what the Philippines needed at the time, because there was a sense that, well, in a democracy it's very difficult to really get anything done, and all of the corruption mechanisms in the bureaucracy, blah blah blah, how can we fix anything? And so throughout Asia there was this kind of trend of sorts where there were many authoritarian leaders that tried to really have strong states and so that they can get things done. And even Ninoy Aquino himself said that if he were to have become leader, he would need 3 years of absolute power for the country to be fixed or something, and then we can kind of transition to regular democracy. And so in Asia around the time there, South Korea had a dictatorship, so did Japan to some degree, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. So it was kind of the trend around that time that in Asia especially, you need a dictatorship at the beginning at least in order to get things done. And so there was some acquiescence at the beginning of martial law in the early 70s, and as we later learn and as we know right now, not everything ended up turning out positively, especially because of all the crony capitalism that was going on, meaning many monopolies by Marcos's cronies. But we already talked a lot about that in the previous videos in the conjugal dictatorship. But towards the end of the 70s, the economy was doing decently well, better than the 60s. And one of the main attributes of the economy that made it so successful, or relatively more successful, was that there was a lot of exporting of rice. So there was a thing that under Marcos called the Green Revolution, is what they describe it as, where there's a lot of rice exportation that happened during that period, more so than any other time in Philippine history. And that plus all the different public works going on, the construction of roads and buildings and monuments and all this stuff, helped improve productivity and efficiency in a way that was quite beneficial to the country overall, at least towards the end of the 70s. But by the turn of the 80s, going into Marcos's third term, things really turned sour very quickly. And a lot of the things that we remember as quite bad about the administration, especially economically, a lot of it happened during this period of time around 82, 83. But we first need to talk about what does it mean that Marcos had a third term? Don't we think of Marcos just ruling from 65 to 86? So technically, Marcos's first term was 65 to 69. There was a second election from 69, and he would have been president. His second term would have been 69 to 73. But because of martial law, it got extended to 81. And in 81, there was another presidential election that Marcos instated, and then he ended up winning by a huge landslide. So why was there even a presidential election in 81? So on paper, in rhetoric, Marcos ended martial law in 1981. So martial law technically lasted from 72 to 81. And from 81 onwards, he kind of moved into what is some kind of like French style government, where there was a president and a prime minister that had power and all this stuff. And the prime minister was Cesar Virata, the person who was the head of the namesake of the UP Business School. He was the prime minister of Marcos from during his third term. But leading up to the presidential elections of 81, there were a couple of changes done so that Marcos would surely win. One of the biggest ones was that he made the age limit to become president 50 years old. Marcos himself became president at 46. But the reason why he put this 50-year-old cap limit was so that Ninoy Aquino couldn't run. He was, I think, he was also in his 40s as well, late 40s, but he wasn't 50 yet. So because of this new law change that he made, Ninoy couldn't run for president, and therefore there was no real opposition candidate that could stand a chance. And so Marcos won by a huge landslide. One of the reasons why he opted to have elections in 81, according to what I read, was that were two things. The first was that the Pope was coming. Pope John Paul II was about to come to the Philippines, and I guess there was this desire to have like a good image to the Pope, to the international community, so they wanted to move from martial law to democracy. The second factor was that Ronald Reagan was about to be president, and I guess in a very similar way, they wanted to have a good image to the new Reagan administration in the United States. And so because of Reagan and the Pope, Marcos had this whole like third election, and he won by a large margin. Martial law was technically over, but many things that were a part of the martial law administration still continued on in practice. So martial law was technically over, and what that meant was that what was removed was the military trials, the military detention, and they released a lot of political prisoners. But Marcos himself still had the power to bypass the assembly in case of any kind of emergency he may have as needed. And all the decrees that he did under martial law continued to remain active. So, and one of the other things that during this period of time, there's a lot of unrest happening, specifically in Mindanao, because partly involving the NPA and the MNLF. And so these two organizations increased in number and strength, and throughout the 80s were also quite active in Mindanao, more active than they've ever been in the history of the Philippines. And so during this time, Mindanao itself, they continued to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in Mindanao, meaning people could still get kind of taken and detained without a warrant. And in Mindanao itself, there's a growing amount of, I guess, brutality and violence done by the military and the police against citizens there, I guess, because under the name of wanting to fight the NPA and the MNLF and all of this stuff. So in a sense, martial law ended, but in terms of totality of violence and brutality, I don't know if it increased, but it definitely did not decrease. And a lot of it was happening in Mindanao. So during the 80s, so Marcos had his next term, and in 1982, there was this big economic crisis of the world, global debt crisis or something, especially that I think Mexico defaulted and many countries in Latin America defaulted and had difficult times paying their loans, and it also ended up affecting the Philippines. I don't want to go into all of the small details of it, but long story short, the economic situation in the Philippines was very bad in the 80s, partly because of world global events as well. And so the peso became floated. We had extremely increased inflation rates, which, without going too much into the economics, what that means for the average person is that the money that you have before has less value because things became more expensive. So say, for example, last year I had a 100 pesos, I could buy X item. Maybe after a year, that same item cost 150 pesos, and that's because many things are becoming more expensive. The peso got floated, and it became from 2 to 1 became 6 to 1, became 20 to 1, and all this stuff you can read up online. But this happened in 82, 83. So again, there's a lot of political instability because of the things going on in Mindanao, especially. There's a lot of economic instability because of the global debt crisis, because of the way in which Marcos and his technocrats are trying to handle the situation. They weren't able to completely kind of fix it in the moment, at least. So 82, 83, there's an increase in the amount of anti-Marcos sentiment, especially through the business community, because the economics was really badly affected at this time. And what that definitely did not help was that because of all the Marcos cronies and stuff, they were really negatively affecting the efficiency of certain industries. The two main ones are the sugar and coconut industries. The sugar industry monopoly was headed by Roberto Benedicto. I think he got it from the Lopezes. And then the coconut industry was headed by Danding Cojuangco, where they go into detail in some of these papers, but they pretty much just he bought a bunch of these coconut land and stuff or all around and whatever. So he ended up making like a giant monopoly of coconut and sugar, and they were both, according to some of the things I read, they had lots of poor policy, corruption, and inefficiency, which led to overall people who worked in these lands, in the coconut lands and the sugar lands, many of them lost their jobs, and that's the reason why many of them ended up feeling more like they wanted to rebel against the government and maybe align themselves with, say, the NPA, for example. Around this time, according to the NPA, they had around 20,000 armed and very heavily trained soldiers, and they said they had 2 million people, a massive base of 2 million people. And so there was a threat of communist insurgency, more so than ever has been in Philippine history. MNLF crisis was also kind of going on, and there's a lot of violence in Mindanao, especially where the military was doing lots of very sketchy things towards civilians. And so, again, in general, during the early 80s, huge political instability, huge economic instability, and in 1983, Ninoy Aquino gets assassinated. Now, Ninoy Aquino was, I'm going to go into this more when I talk about Cory Aquino's legacy and her presidency and everything, but Ninoy Aquino at the time was in the US, and he decided to come back home exactly at a time when the country was very unstable. And supposedly, part of the reason why he wanted to go back home was that he wanted to convince Marcos. Implicitly, the implicit assumption is that he wanted to convince Marcos to have him be the successor to Marcos, because Marcos was widely reported to be dying in 82, 83. And he was supposedly already saying goodbye to people or something. He was really in dire health. And so Ninoy Aquino supposedly came back here partly because he thought he could maybe, in this very time of Philippine crisis, he wanted to step into the place and maybe save the country or maybe be the successor to Marcos in his administration. But as we all know, he gets assassinated and he gets shot in the head, a single bullet to the head, by this guy named Rolando Galman. Now, again, lots of economic instability, political instability. Ninoy gets assassinated. He was the main figure in the opposition against Marcos. And after Galman shoots Ninoy, Galman himself gets shot on the tarmac. And so after this whole thing happens, 25 different military officials get arrested and tried for this assassination of Ninoy Aquino. And this becomes a whole big issue because at the end of this whole trial of sorts, the 25 military officials, including General Ver, who is the person who was the head of the Presidential Security Command under Marcos, his secret force, all of them get acquitted. And not only do they all get acquitted, but Fabian Ver, ends up becoming the chief of the AFP after. Now, during the same time, again, the military was having lots of problems with their own kind of image because of all the violence that was being reported on from the side of the military in Mindanao. And so there was a faction in the military, in the AFP, that wanted to reform the military because they said there was so much, corruption, violence, robbery that was from the side of the military, and they wanted to make the military clean again and wanted to fix the military. And this reform movement of the military was called RAM. I think it's a reform of the armed movement or something like that, but it was called RAM, and this is an important these are important characters that we'll get into later on when we talk about the People Power Revolution in '86. So anyway, just put it to the side first. Because of military abuses, there was a RAM that was forming that wanted to reform the military. And many of them were, I think, under Enrile and Ramos. And on this other side, you have the failed Aquino Galman murder thing that everyone got acquitted and everyone got really mad about it. There was a lot of pressure for Marcos that, his country was very unstable. Things seemed to really going in a very southward direction. And people are, they're not certain about exactly what the reasons were. Some say it was Marcos' decision, some say he was pressured by the US. But in 1985, I think late 85, Marcos decided that he's going to I want to prove to you that I still have the support of the Filipino people through clean elections. So I'm going to have a snap election. It was supposed to be 87, but he moved it a year early to 1986. February 86, we'll have a snap election so that I can show the world that the Filipinos still want me as their leader, and that things are stable here in the country because of this kind of thing. So he wanted to have an election, and we will go into the results and the procedure of the snap election and what leads up to the People Power Revolution in the next video. But as you know, a lot of this stuff is quite interesting, so I hope you think about all this stuff over the next few days or weeks, and see what I have to say in the next video about the People Power Revolution.